No one expected this. For decades, the world has operated under the assumption that the United States, for all its flaws, is too big to fail. Its military reach, financial dominance, cultural influence, these weren't just power, they were gravity. Other nations, especially those deeply embedded in the Western-led global system, depended on that gravity to maintain their own stability. But now, as internal fractures grow within America, economic stagnation, political division, eroding trust in institutions, the once unshakable foundation is beginning to tremble. And the world is quietly asking, what happens if the United States falls? The answer is not uniform. Some nations would weather the shock. Others would adapt. But there is one country, more than any other, that would not survive the ripple. A country whose identity, security, and economy are tied so tightly to American power that without it, collapse would be inevitable. That country is Israel. From the outside, Israel appears strong, militarily advanced, technologically sophisticated, economically dynamic. But peel back the layers, and a more fragile reality emerges. Israel is not just an ally of the United States. It is, in many ways, an extension of American strategic architecture in the Middle East. Billions in annual military aid. Decades of diplomatic protection. Intelligence coordination, missile defense systems, shared cyber infrastructure, and guaranteed arms supply, all underwritten by the United States. This relationship has shaped modern Israel's position in the region. It has allowed it to project strength far beyond its size, to deter hostile neighbors, and to maintain a qualitative military edge unmatched in its neighborhood. But that strength is conditional. It is dependent. And if that support were to vanish, not incrementally, but suddenly, as it would in the event of an American collapse, the consequences would be immediate and existential. First, there's the military equation. Israel's defense doctrine rests on rapid mobilization, technological superiority, and a constant flow of advanced weaponry. Patriot systems, F-35 fighters, bunker-busting bombs, missile interceptors. Many are made in or supplied by the U.S., or rely on U.S. parts, funding, or approval for use. Without American resupply, Israel's ability to sustain operations in a prolonged conflict would be severely limited. Its Iron Dome would face shortages. Its Air Force would shrink. Its deterrence, the very thing that keeps enemies at bay, would weaken. Then there's the geopolitical layer. Israel exists in a region of cold wars, proxy battles, and historic animosities. It is surrounded by states and non-state actors that, in some form or another, oppose its existence. Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas, elements within Syria, Iraq, and even factions in Jordan. While American power looms in the background, that opposition is held in check. But remove that power, remove the implied threat of U.S. retaliation, the diplomatic shield at the United Nations, the strategic ambiguity over joint operations, and a dangerous vacuum emerges. Israel would find itself isolated, surrounded, and vulnerable to emboldened adversaries who see an opening. Not just militarily, but diplomatically. Countries that once hesitated to challenge Israel openly may do so. Arms embargoes could reappear. International sanctions could resurface. Alliances would shift. And without the global leverage of a powerful patron, Israel would struggle to navigate the storm. But the collapse wouldn't stop at defense. The economic fallout would follow closely. Israel's tech-driven economy, often dubbed the startup nation, is deeply intertwined with U.S. capital. American venture firms fund Israeli startups. Israeli companies list on U.S. stock exchanges. Bilateral trade, tax agreements, and joint research initiatives form a lifeline for Israeli innovation. If America's financial system falls, if the dollar weakens, if investment dries up, if markets seize, Israel's economy would feel it almost instantly. The shekel would fall. Imports would become more expensive. Exports would struggle as U.S. consumers pulled back. The brain drain could accelerate as talent looks abroad for more stable opportunities. The dominoes would tip quickly, from Wall Street to Tel Aviv. Social cohesion, already strained by internal political divides, would likely fray. Israel is not a unified society. Tensions between secular and religious communities, between left and right, between Jewish and Arab populations, would deepen under the pressure. Economic hardship, military uncertainty, and regional threats would pour gasoline on existing divisions. Protests, civil unrest, even political paralysis could follow, weakening the country from within just as threats mount from without. And in the chaos, the question of national identity would resurface. What does it mean to be a secure Jewish state in a world without American power? For generations, Zionism has carried with it not just the dream of sovereignty, but the assurance of survival, and that assurance has long rested on a foundation of U.S. backing. If that foundation crumbles, what replaces it? Self-reliance? Regional alliances? Nuclear ambiguity? None offer the guarantees that Washington once did. The world would watch closely. Russia, China, Iran, each with its own regional ambitions, would see opportunity in the void. Not necessarily to invade, but to reshape the region's order, to test boundaries, to force realignments. And Israel, for all its resilience, cannot stand alone forever in a storm of that scale. None of this is guaranteed. But the risk is real. Because Israel's strength has never existed in a vacuum. It has always depended on the unspoken assumption that America would be there, with weapons, with diplomacy, with pressure, with presence. If that assumption dies, the balance collapses. And the collapse would be fast. Unlike larger powers with diversified economies, broad alliances, and geographic buffers, Israel's margin for error is razor-thin. Its enemies are close. Its territory is small. Its population is politically divided. And its safety net is made in Washington. That's why, if the United States truly falls, not just economically, but as a global force, Israel may be the first to follow. Under the weight of a collapsing U.S. presence, Israel would be forced to confront choices it has never seriously had to make. Without the American security umbrella, without the guarantee of military aid and diplomatic cover, every assumption underpinning its modern identity would come under pressure. And the internal system, political, social, and economic, would begin to fracture. The first crack would appear in the military doctrine. For decades, Israel's defense strategy relied on two pillars: technological superiority and unconditional resupply. In a prolonged conflict, it always assumed the U.S. would replenish what was lost: missiles, fuel, precision munitions. If that support vanishes, Israel's planning must shift overnight. Stockpiles would shrink. Readiness would erode. Suddenly, deterrence would be a question mark, and the enemies who once hesitated might begin to probe. That fear would ripple across society. Israel's citizens, long used to living under threat but with confidence in their defense forces, would feel a new vulnerability. The Iron Dome might run dry. The Air Force might not have replacements. Hospitals, already under strain, could falter under mass casualty events without foreign emergency assistance. Civil defense infrastructure, once bolstered by shared drills and U.S. intelligence, would be exposed. And for the first time in a generation, many Israelis would begin to ask, are we truly safe? This insecurity would pour directly into the political system, which is already stretched thin by years of division, repeated elections, and widening ideological gaps. The ultra-Orthodox and secular sectors of society hold vastly different visions of the state. The Arab minority, often politically sidelined, would be watching how a weakened Israel negotiates its identity under stress. Protest movements, already frequent, could intensify. Confidence in leadership would plummet. Some might call for hard-line consolidation. Others, for constitutional reform. Others still, for exile. And then comes the external realignment. Without the US, Israel would be forced to find new patrons. The most likely candidates are troubling. China might offer infrastructure and economic lifelines, but at a price. Beijing does not offer unconditional support. It expects alignment with its interests, silence on human rights, and access to ports, data, and influence. In return, it might provide capital, perhaps even weapons, but not protection. And certainly not moral backing at the UN. Russia, already tied into Syria and courting Iran, would see an opportunity to pull Israel closer. But the trust is thin, and the risk enormous. Russia plays all sides, and would gladly use Israeli vulnerability as a bargaining chip in broader global negotiations. For Jerusalem, this would be dangerous terrain, and the sense of strategic loneliness would deepen. Some Israeli officials might float a regional pivot. Could Israel finally normalize ties with Saudi Arabia? Could a pan-Arab security framework absorb it? Possibly, but unlikely in the face of rising extremism and public resistance across the region. Without U.S. mediation, those talks would be fragile at best, and performative at worst. And Iran, emboldened by the absence of the U.S., would step up both rhetoric and operations. It would test borders, fund proxies, increase cyber attacks, and openly question Israel's survivability. Economically, the situation would spiral. The Israeli shekel, already volatile in moments of war or political paralysis, would face historic collapse. Investors would flee. Real estate would crash. Major tech companies, many with dual headquarters in the US and Tel Aviv, would begin quietly shifting operations elsewhere. Foreign capital would dry up. Tourism, already battered by conflict, would vanish. The innovation economy, Israel's pride, would suffer a brain drain, as young talent look for visas in safer, more stable places. And in this cascading crisis, emigration would rise. Quietly at first. A few families leaving for Canada, Germany, Australia. Then waves. Then headlines. For a nation built on return, the reverse movement would be existential. The idea of Israel, as a permanent, thriving, modern refuge, would crack. Not because of invasion, but because of global abandonment, domestic fracture, and strategic isolation. In the long term, some in Israel might advocate for becoming a neutral fortress state. Others might call for a regional federation. Still others would propose radical reinvention, perhaps a new model of statehood that emphasizes resilience over expansion, diplomacy over deterrence. But all of those visions would be shaped under pressure. Not through choice, but necessity. And none of them would resemble the Israel we know today. The fall of the United States as a global pillar wouldn't just destabilize Israel. It would unravel the very context that allowed it to exist in its current form. It would expose fault lines not only in policy, but in purpose. In meaning. In the story the country tells itself. And around it, the region would shift, too. Egypt might drift into deeper authoritarianism. Jordan could face an identity crisis. Turkey would jockey for dominance. Iran would seize initiative. And the Palestinian issue, long trapped in stasis, could explode in unpredictable ways. Because when the gravity disappears, everything floats. No more orbits. No more stability. And for Israel, that gravity has always been the United States. Remove it, and the countdown begins. And as the countdown accelerates, the psychological collapse may prove even more devastating than the political or military unraveling. For decades, Israel has built its identity on two pillars: the memory of existential threat, and the promise of unwavering security. It is a society shaped by survival, by collective memory, by the belief that no matter how hostile the neighborhood, there is strength and resilience, and an ally standing behind it. But when that ally disappears, the psychological shield goes with it. The loss would not just be strategic, it would be personal. For soldiers who've trained with American equipment, for diplomats who've grown up assuming U.S. vetoes at the UN, for civilians who believed Iron Dome was guaranteed, the realization would be slow, then sudden. That support wasn't eternal. That the alliance was never unconditional. That the unthinkable, abandonment, has become reality. And in that void, something darker could take hold. The rhetoric would harden. Some factions would call for total militarization. Others would demand internal purges, scapegoats, blame. Civil liberties, already strained during times of conflict, could evaporate under emergency decrees. A creeping authoritarianism could arise, not in defiance of collapse, but as a reaction to it. At the same time, extremist actors, both within and outside, would smell opportunity. Settler movements could escalate land grabs, leading to open conflict across the West Bank. Militants in Gaza might launch broader offensives, sensing weakness. Hezbollah could engage the north. And Iran, now free of U.S. pressure, might push closer to a nuclear threshold, gambling that a fractured Israel lacks the backing to respond. And while all of this unfolds, the international community would stand paralyzed. Europe, divided and dependent on fragile coalitions, would issue statements but little action. The UN would convene emergency sessions, but without the US to guide the outcome, paralysis would dominate. Humanitarian corridors might open, but they would be overwhelmed. Refugee flows would surge. War crimes allegations would return to the forefront. And amid it all, Israel would face something it has not experienced since its founding: genuine uncertainty about its future. Meanwhile, inside Israeli society, the idea of unity, once forged in adversity, would begin to crack. The divide between Ashkenazi and Mizrahi, secular and ultra-Orthodox, Arab and Jewish, left and right, would widen into political chaos. The ruling coalition, whatever its makeup, would likely fall. New elections would follow, perhaps rapidly, perhaps violently. Fringe parties would gain traction. Moderate voices would be drowned out. And in that chaos, the vision of Israel as a democratic, pluralistic state could vanish. Diaspora Jews, especially in the U.S., would be thrown into a moral and emotional crisis. For generations, Israel has been not just a homeland, but a symbol. A central point of cultural identity. But what happens when that symbol begins to fracture? Would American Jews push for a rescue? Would they call for intervention? Would they turn inward, distancing themselves to protect their own communities from the fallout? And all the while, China and Russia would be circling. China may offer emergency loans, technology, even diplomatic recognition in return for long-term influence, infrastructure control, intelligence access, ports on the Mediterranean. But what China provides in resources, it demands in obedience. Israel, long proud of its independence, would face a new kind of dependency, colder, transactional, and with no moral pretense. Russia, on the other hand, would seize the chaos for leverage. It might offer itself as a mediator, a weapons supplier, a counterweight to Iran. But only in exchange for strategic concessions, for alignment in global forums, for silence on Ukraine or Syria. Moscow doesn't rescue, it barters. And in a weakened state, Israel would have no choice but to listen. In the long view, some form of Israeli statehood would likely survive. The people are resilient. The culture is strong. The land has endured millennia of upheaval. But the version of Israel that dominated headlines for half a century, modern, confident, backed by a superpower, that version would be gone. What would remain is a nation in retreat. One rethinking its identity. One redefining its alliances. One rebuilding not from loss of territory, but loss of certainty. And perhaps that's the most haunting part of this scenario. Not that Israel might be attacked, or surrounded, or isolated, but that it might be forgotten. That without the US to amplify its voice, to guarantee its defense, to demand its place at the table, the world might simply move on. History is not kind to small states without patrons. And in the absence of America, Israel would have to learn what it means to be truly alone. Because this is still only the beginning.